Hello, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast. This is a podcast where we break down and deconstruct the false idols and icons of the digital age in search of more authentic, esoteric spirituality. This is your host, Georgina Rose, and I would like to start this podcast with an announcement. I am hosting a esoteric group trip to Greece with the lovely people at Trova Trip. If you are interested in coming, sign up in the show notes or the description box, depending what platform you are on. Without further ado, I would like to jump right into the topic. So, today we are going to be discussing the idea of the fourth way, which is a metaphysical system that I have come across here and there, but I do not think has been widely discussed in the modern esoteric online sphere. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there. So, I have decided to bring on a very special guest who is pretty versed in these subjects and knows this topic pretty well. Can you introduce yourself, say who you are, and give a little bit of background on what perspective you come from?
Yes, thank you so much. So some of your audience may know my account as the Fourth Way on Twitter. I also run an account, the Fourth Way, on YouTube, where I produce different videos regarding different spiritual topics. About myself personally, I'm just a normal person, had a relatively normal middle class upbringing, and got into a number of spiritual topics like psychedelics and esotericism and philosophy. I've always kind of been somewhat interested in those topics, but they became a lot more interesting to me about 10 years or so ago when I had certain experiences that kind of led me down the rabbit hole, so to speak. And I've been down the rabbit hole for quite a while now. One of the biggest rabbit holes that I went down was the fourth way. So I kind of became sort of a self-taught expert in different philosophies of the fourth way, as well as the history of it in relation to esotericism. So all of that I find very interesting. There's reasons I got into that, which we don't have to get into, but I'm happy to get into at some point if you'd like. But yeah, so I've spent a lot of time reading works on the fourth way, both by the original authors, Ouspensky and Gurdjieff, as well as a number of different historians and biographers and different commentaries on the work and things like that. So I'm pretty familiar with a lot of the literature that goes along with it, as well as the more practical kind of insights of the system, and as well as some more of the esoteric sides to the system that aren't as well known. But yeah, I like to study all religions. I think I'm a student of the world. I really got into different paths: Christianity, Taoism, different Hindu philosophies, and um, different things like alchemy, and have dipped my toes into different paganism and different things like that. But for me, the fourth way really combines a lot of those things. It's really to me it's like an umbrella under which a lot of these different niche philosophies can sit, and can explain a lot of things that are not explainable in many other systems. So that's kind of why I've gravitated toward it over the years. But yeah, hopefully that all makes sense, and happy to take any questions on that.
So, what in its simplest form is the fourth way? Like, what does it mean? What is the system of sort of synthesis, is kind of what I'm getting from what you were previously saying. But what is it?
So if you look at just the strict definition of how the fourth way came into being, what we have is the recorded conversations of Ouspensky and Gurdjieff. And this was a system that Gurdjieff essentially said came from the mystery schools. So the mystery schools, you're probably familiar, different Greek and Egyptian mystery schools have existed, and lots of different types of religions, including like Buddhism, Hinduism, and stuff like that, also have different mystery schools, and Sufis, and there's been lots of mystery schools over the years. And Gurdjieff was a student of all of these mystery schools. He started more in he was born in Armenia, I believe, but he came from a Greek slash Russian slash Armenian type of background. So he was kind of living in a different age in like the late 1800s. It was more of a definitely kind of where the modern age meets the ancient age, and he was kind of grew up next to all of these temples. All of these mystery schools were, literally just like right around him where he grew up. And so he was friends with a lot of the people who um, were in these mystery schools, joined some groups that would specifically like infiltrate mystery groups, mystery schools, and then they would come back together, and then they would combine their information of all of the mystery schools, what all their teachings were, how they all related to each other. And he said by doing this, he gained more in a span of 20 years or so doing this than a single person could have done in maybe 100 lifetimes by working by themselves. So this is where he said he got all of his knowledge from. And so the fourth way, he said, was part of the mystery school system. Most of the mystery schools themselves were divided into one of three types of ways. You had the way of the body, you had the way of the emotions, and you had the way of the mind. And so most of these schools were arranged in one of these three methods. And even all of the um, exoteric religions like Christianity and Islam and things like that were also set up according, because they were created by the mystery schools, according to Gurdjieff. So all of these exoteric religions were ultimately created by the esoteric religions in the mystery schools. And so this is where we have all the religions and all the teachings from, essentially, according to Gurdjieff. And so the fourth way was a different type of school. It wasn't a permanent school, according to Gurdjieff. It was more of a temporary school, according to the needs of the spiritual community, and it would, or kind of come and go as needed. And it was essentially a place where it was a little bit more advanced, and it also combined the methodologies of the three schools into one methodology, so that you could target all three of the centers in one exercise versus working one center for 20 years and then having to work another center for 20 years and then hopefully eventually advancing in that kind of step-by-step method. The fourth way was intended to be more of a buckshot method of kind of doing all of these things at once to try to accelerate the process.
So, with the fourth way, would you consider it kind of taking like a perennialist theological stance where like all the religions have grains of truth to them? Or is it more taking a stance where it's like we bring all these things together to find some truth that people just haven't pieced all the way together? Like, where does it stand on the whole? Like, are all religions true or all religions not true? Because I'm seeing so much syncretism in this system. I'm wondering what its actual view on that sort of debate is, because I've noticed systems with a lot of syncretism kind of have very different beliefs on that question.
So the way Gurdjieff framed this was, his idea was that originally there was some type of civilization pre-Egypt where all of these religions originated. And so there was one religion that kind of was the main religion that everyone believed in, and this religion set up these different schools in different areas. So they had different mystery schools in Egypt, they had different mystery schools in Mesopotamia, they had mystery schools in other places, in India and different places like that. And so this is, in his opinion, this is where all the major religions were born, was from the civilization that existed pre-Egypt. And then eventually what happened was that that civilization collapsed. Then these religious schools kind of lost touch with the master plan. So they all had pieces of this puzzle, but no one really was there to put it all back together. And that's one of the things that Gurdjieff and Ouspensky were trying to do, is they were trying to find all of these pieces and put them back together. That's why Ouspensky's book In Search of the Miraculous was titled, the full title of that book is In Search of the Miraculous Fragments of an Unknown Teaching. And that was something that was suggested to Ouspensky from Gurdjieff, because he said that really what he had was fragments of a much larger, entirely holistic, complete system, but that his system wasn't quite complete because some of the knowledge either he hadn't found yet or had been lost over the years or something like that. But his main point was that there did exist in Egypt an extremely detailed kind of system of magic, of awakening, of human being and astrology and all these. They had a very deep knowledge of all of these subjects, and they have tried to pass it down to us through these mystery schools. But over the years, obviously, um, many mystery schools have died out or have gone further underground, so the information is harder to find. But that was his goal, was to kind of bring out this hidden esoteric information that had been carried in these mystery schools for so long, and kind of bring it out to the public to give mankind kind of a different way of viewing and operating the world, but really different in the sense that it's really not anything new. It's actually quite old, but it's new to us because we've lost touch with it.
So when you were, if you are to learn the fourth way, do you study like a particular curriculum or set path that the fourth way has like given people, or is it kind of just using the fourth way as a guiding philosophy and then going through the mysteries yourself?
It's so great question. One of the things that Gurdjieff said about the fourth way is that it's something you're almost called to in a certain sense. Like it can be something that you want to do, but you have to. Um, it's a very it's more. How am I trying to describe this? Sorry, it's quite complex to try to describe, but I would definitely say it's not for necessarily a beginner, not someone who's just starting off a spiritual path. This I think it does a little better to fill in the gaps in some senses, because what the system is really um, it's a lot of systems put together that all kind of relate to advancing your state of consciousness and your degree of awareness and autonomy. So that's really what everything in the system is geared toward. And the kind of the backbone, I would say, of the system is something called self-remembering. And self-remembering is similar to meditation, I would say. Like, and I would recommend anyone who does the fourth way to do both self-remembering and meditation. But in terms of my own practice, I have found that self-remembering is more valuable for me than meditation, because it kind of brings that meditative viewpoint to the real world instead of the meditation room, where sometimes it's harder to bring that energy into your everyday life, whereas self-remembering is very much about bringing that experience of kind of oneness and peace and awareness into the everyday world. And that's why one of the things that Gurdjieff said about the fourth way is that it's not one of the systems where you need to go to a monastery or you need to go to a cave and meditate. The best way to do the fourth way is exactly where you are in all the noise of life. Crank it up to 11, push yourself past beyond your limits, and see what you're really capable of. So that's the type of that's not necessarily for everyone, but for the people that are into that type of self-improvement, I think that this has a lot of good insights.
Yeah. Besides self-remembering, are there other sort of specific techniques that go along with the fourth way that are taught?
Yeah, so there's different dances. There are different fourth way groups that you can get involved in all over the world. And there's Gurdjieff was one of, in addition to all of his other things, there were he was a kind of a Sufi dance master, and he would develop these very intricate dances that were intended to stimulate your body, your mind, and your emotions at once. And so there are different places. If you can get involved in a fourth way group, or you can get involved in some of these dances. There's also different sensing exercises. Um, there's a number of a couple dozen different, like the morning sitting and different types of like exercises where you lay down and you sense the different parts of your body to try to uh, bring your mind, body, and emotions into it. Gurdjieff had different techniques on how to push yourself in terms of your energy levels to find your kind of your second wind, or your energy reserve. He was very big about pushing yourself beyond your limits so that you find out that you actually have no energy limit. Your energy is nearly infinite. So he would kind of push his students to do hard physical labor and things like that to try to push their limits. That's something you can do if you want, but it's not necessarily. All of these things are optional, just depending on kind of what your particular desires and preferences are for your own spiritual development. But these are some of the things that some of the practices involved. In addition, there's also something called the enneagram of personality, which some it's kind of a split in the fourth way community whether or not that's an actual acceptable kind of form of self-improvement. I think it is. Personally, I'm a big fan of the enneagram and actually do some enneagram consulting. But that's also a very complex part of this history, because Gurdjieff introduced the enneagram in its current form, but of course he didn't introduce the personality enneagram system that was developed later on by someone else. And so there's some debate as to whether or not that was ultimately, whether or not that's, kind of an acceptable fourth way practice or not. But a lot of the teachings that Gurdjieff made about personality and essence and different things like that were worked into the Enneagram system. So I personally think it's a valid, tool as well in terms of, self development on the fourth way. So it's really a hodgepodge of a lot of different metaphors, a lot of different techniques, a lot of different ways of viewing the world to try to kind of get your mind and kind of body open on multiple different levels, and to try to bring some sort of synchronization between them all.
Yeah, I'm very curious about what he thought about the Enneagram, because when I think of the Enneagram, I think of, and this is definitely like the mainstream perception of, basically like a personality test that sort of puts your personality on a specific axis. It's interesting that what he was talking about, you say, is kind of different than that. What is the difference between his ideas of the Enneagram and that sort of popular version that you see all over the internet?
So his enneagram was not really focused on personality. That kind of came later with a guy named Oscar Icazo in like the '60s or '70s, I think. And now he was supposedly a student of someone, I think, who had been a student of Gurdjieff, and so he did incorporate, I think, a number of Gurdjieffian things into the enneagram of personality. However, that's not the way that Gurdjieff was using it. When Gurdjieff introduced it, well, first of all, he introduced it, but he I don't think that he ever said where it came from. And even if he did say where it came from, I'm not sure that we could 100% believe him, because that's a whole nother rabbit hole that we could get into. But anyway, so we don't quite know where he came from. He probably got it from the Sufis, or from potentially the Desert Fathers of the Catholics. But regardless of wherever he got it from, he was using it more to design dances and other things. Now, he did talk a lot into Ospensky and Search for the Miraculous about the Enneagram, and he used to talk about how the Enneagram was a very important part of the mystery schools, and how anyone in a serious mystery school would know the Enneagram pretty well, and could and was it was pretty much a tool where you could divide up really anything into an enneagram in terms of like a system of knowledge. So you could take pretty much any system of knowledge or any organism and all of their parts, and you could put it in an enneagram and get to understand that thing better. So that was kind of Gurdjieff's idea of what the enneagram was. It was kind of like a universal fractal, which you could divide up different parts in different ratios and see different things. So that's how he was using it. It was, so I think he would approve of it being used as a personality tool, because again, he thought that you could really put anything into the enneagram. But in terms of what he was using it for, he was using it more to design dances and to different movements and things like that that he would use it for. And then he would also, kind of teach the Enneagram, just as an abstract, here's how you utilize it to divide up knowledge. But he wasn't necessarily using it as a personality tool.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Do you think it's worth using as a personality tool? Like, as someone who, since you are kind of versed in this subject, how do you feel about the way that Enneagram is sort of treated by mainstream internet culture?
So yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of people who are, both pro Enneagram and anti Enneagram, and some people who just think it's kind of meh. I can only speak from my own experience, which I've had a pretty good experience with the Enneagram, but you do have to you do have to utilize it in a certain way, and I think the way that some things are utilized is, more on the surface level, and therefore a lot of people don't get a lot out of it. But when you look at what the Enneagram really is, it's actually a multi-thousand year, probably old, ancient wisdom tool that has very accurately mapped out the shadow. And I think that shadow work is, one of the most important parts of a spiritual practice. And so, if you can really understand what the Enneagram is telling you about your shadow, which is your personality according to Gurdjieff, then you can really balance your personality with what he called essence, which is kind of your true, your higher self, or your true self, or whatever you want to call it. But and so yeah, you can be more authentic. You can live more to, kind of a feeling of purpose when you're living out of your essence instead of your personality. And so learning how to spot your personality, learning how to integrate your personality, it's a very important part of the spiritual journey, in my opinion. And this is one of the best tools to do that, I think, because it's really incorporating so much wisdom into, a really small package.
Yeah, discussing the shadow and the idea of shadow integration. I often hear that discussed in a kind of Jungian context. Is there a Jungian influence on the fourth way?
Um, so Jung, it's an interesting story between Jung and Gurdjieff because they kind of lived around the same time. I wouldn't say that one really influenced the other because they kind of came out. They kind of came out around the same time, but like separately. And Jung did know about Gurdjieff and Ospensky, but he didn't really dive deep into them. However, um, one of his most famous students, and was kind of like his lieutenant, and was, the supposed heir of Jung's psychotherapy, kind of practice, and overall, thought leadership in that space. But a guy named Maurice Nicoll, who was, one of the had one of the top medical practices in London in psychotherapy at the time, and he was a very strong Jungian, and um, he wrote several. He actually met. He It's actually an interesting story. Okay, because I think feel like you'll appreciate this since you're into paganism. He writes a letter to, it was either, I think it was Hermes, but it could have been Thoth, but one of those. He writes a letter to one of them asking for wisdom, and he had kind of grown. He had grown a little bit tired of Jung's teachings, even though he had learned a lot about Jung's teachings. He thought that there was more, and he was kind of desperate to find the next thing, kind of beyond Jung. And so he wrote a letter to Hermes, or Hermes or Thoth, I forget which one, but essentially asking for wisdom, and asking, to send someone his way that could show him the path. And then, like a month or two later, he meets Ospensky, and then Ospensky introduces him to Gurdjieff. He hears Gurdjieff do a lecture one time, and he pretty much sells everything, his very successful medical practice included, and moves him and his wife and children to France to study with Gurdjieff. And it's a very hard life because, like, he's making him do all these, um, crazy physical things. He's making him. He forbids him to read. He's trying to get him out of his shell, trying to, shake up his world a little bit. and he ends up staying there for a couple of years. And even though it was chaotic, he loved his time there and was ends up kind of being his own fourth way teacher when he moves back to England. Um, so you have this Jungian Gurdjieff crossover, and there's a lot of synergy between the ideas in terms of like the integration of the shadow and things like that. There's some differences, some small differences, but I think that there's a lot of synergy between Jung and Gurdjieff for sure.
Interesting. So speaking of that story with Thoth, that was really interesting. Is there a like mysticism or ritual component in the fourth way's sort of sphere?
Yeah, for sure. So you know, this was something that I don't think it was necessarily part of the main teaching, but we definitely have records of Gurdjieff giving his students exercises where he instructs them to pray to different entities and kind of gather in this sort of like spiritual energy from them, and almost like a prayer to a goddess or something, like a channeling or something like that. So, and there's also, different instances. Gurdjieff was definitely schooled in magic, both black and white magic. And there's multiple tales of him healing people, as well as communicating telepathically through large distances with some of his students, as well as changing his appearance on demand and various things like that. So uh, he also had a very magnetic personality, and if he saw you in person, he could pretty much get you to do whatever he wanted. Like almost no one could resist him if he actually wanted you to do something. And it's a good thing that all the stories of him were him, being nice to people or just being, a little bit mischievous sometimes with that ability. But um, he definitely had a very strong magical side. Now he was more interested in teaching the awakening portion of that to his students, and he may have taught some of his more advanced students some things that were a little more esoteric magic related. But Gurdjieff himself was schooled in lots of different things, including pharmacology from Tibet. He knew all of the different drugs that Tibetan mystics used, and he was very skilled in the use of different drugs and hormones as part of his technique as well. There was one group that he taught called the Ladies of the Rope. They were based in Paris in the 40s, I think, or 30s, and it was a bunch of mostly lesbian literary writers that lived in Paris at the time. And I think they were mostly American. So it was a group of women literary authors. And they came to Gurdjieff and they were like, hey, we want you to help us. And so Gurdjieff said, okay, I'll do it. The problem is, you're kind of advanced in age, and there's different factors here that mean that I may have to do some more extreme methods in order to actually be able to help you. And he asked if they would agree to that, and they all did. And they were called the Ladies of the Rope because he said that he would be taking them on an adventure in which was very dangerous, and we would all need to be tied together as if on a rope as we go through these kind of inner experiences he was going to show them. And so he gave them a series of injections as well as a series of prayers and kind of spiritual exercises to he said that these things could do, we don't know exactly what the effects were, but we know just in general that he said that these types of techniques could help you see the future. They could help you see the possibilities better, so that you could see what you could become, so that you would more diligently work towards that if you knew it was for sure within a possibility for you to achieve a certain ability or a certain power. They could heal, they could allow you to remote view, they could do a number of things. So Gurdjieff was schooled in all of these things. We don't know exactly what drugs and hormones that he was giving these ladies of the rope, but he was giving them some type of injections, which um, sometimes he would tell them not to drink. Sometimes it would um, cause them to get hot, as if they were um, going through some type of hormonal flash or something like that. So, but he would give them very specific um, exercises and these different prayers to do, and he, um, the reports. He worked with these ladies for about 2 or so years, doing this type of things, and a lot of his students said that this group of ladies advanced far quickly than any of Gurdjieff's other students. So it's obvious that he um, was a very skilled pharmacologist, in addition to a number of other fields of esoteric wisdom.
So, going off that, would modern fourth way practitioners, is there a use of like entheogens or psychedelics that's common? Because I could definitely see that inspiring people to go sort of that route.
So there's a lot of different fourth way schools, and I'll be honest, I'm not familiar with a ton of them. But I know that like there's the fourth way schools that there was kind of a split between Ouspensky and Gurdjieff at some point during both of their careers, and so Ouspensky kind of went off to England and started his own school, and so there's a number of fourth way people that follow more Ouspensky's method, and Ouspensky's method is a little more intellectual, a little more rigid, um, and but it's very uh, it's very it's easier to understand. We'll just put it that way, even though it is complex, but it's simpler to understand. Whereas Gurdjieff, there's other schools that went more in the Gurdjieff direction, because after Gurdjieff and Ouspensky split, Gurdjieff, although I think um, he was still teaching the same kind of material, the way that he delivered his teaching completely changed, and so there's a big kind of split in the fourth way community between those who think that Gurdjieff's later teachings were better versus the people who think that his earlier teachings and Ouspensky's interpretations are better. So it just kind of depends on which way you go. I mean, I don't really take a side either way. I think they were both, they both have good wisdom and insight that you can learn from. But I would say in terms of most of the modern fourth way schools, drugs are not really a part of it. I mean, I could be wrong, but I haven't heard that. It's more about self remembering and the dances and just general kind of teachings of the philosophy and of psychology and things like that to try to help you understand yourself better. That's really what most of the schools focus on these days. Gurdjieff was kind of a unique animal in that he was so studied in so many different esoteric topics. Like he could change on command and just completely do something completely different at a moment's notice. And one second he could be working with pharmacology, another second he could be working with mythology, another second he could be working with psychology or science, or there's medicine. There's so many different topics that he was familiar with, and so many different ways that he could like try to influence you psychologically. I think he was really a tinkerer in a sense. Like he was someone who was extremely advanced, and he was just like constantly experimenting with people and with different ways to try to improve someone's consciousness. And so he would try one thing, and then he would try another thing, and then he would try another thing, and all of these things were completely different. So it's kind of hard to say, oh, this is the way you do the fourth way, because it's such a broad set of different types of ideas and techniques and experiments that really, I think the best way to think about it is just like try to think of it almost like a buffet line, where you can like, okay, I want this thing, I think this thing could help, I think this thing could help, oh, okay, that thing, not so much, I see what they're doing with it, but not for me. And that's kind of the way I treat it, is like, okay, there's a lot of wisdom here, let me see what resonates, let me see what um, what speaks to me today, what I can improve on, those types of things. And usually every time I go back to it, I find something new that I didn't see the first time. I'm like, okay, yeah, that's a good idea. And maybe I wasn't ready to see that a couple years ago, but I see it now, or something like that. So it's very layered, it's very complex, but it does, I think, form a cohesive whole if you look at it holistically. But it can be easy to get lost in the weeds.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You've mentioned dance a few times as a technique that is commonly used in fourth way schools. What role does dance play in the system, and why is dance of such interest?
So dance, think of like whirling dervish dances, how you are moving in these patterns and you're spinning and but you're also participating with the other partners. You may swing with this partner and then you swing around with this partner. um, Gurdjieff really modeled these dances to kind of mirror astrology, like the movement of planets and things like that. So it was extremely number one, it was very complex, so you had to have a lot of attention on your body. But then you're participating with the other dancers, so you have to be in your heart, and then you're participating, in something that's complex, so your mind has to be sharp. So all of these things have to be participating at once. So this is the whole goal of different fourth way techniques, is to try to combine the awareness of your body, your mind, and your emotions at once. So dance is a great way to do that because, especially a complex dance where you're dancing with a partner, it's going to put you in your emotions, it's going to put you in your body, it's going to make your mind work, and all of these things have to work together very closely in order to accomplish the goal. So that's it's a perfect technique in order to try to synchronize those things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you've mentioned several times about different fourth way schools. If someone is to want to learn about the fourth way, do they sort of join a school? Do they find a mentor? Is there like communal organization? Because I spent a long time in Thelema, and in that community, there were several like organized groups that existed. Like, what is the community infrastructure of the fourth way look like? Like, is it kind of people independently? Is it people with mentors? Are there formal, like, literal schools? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so there's different literal schools. Some of them are like, there's one that is, I believe it's based in New York, and it's like directly, they kind of have a lineage directly to Gurdjieff. I think it went from Gurdjieff to Gene Salzman, who was his student, and then I don't know who the new person is, but but they continue on a lot of Gurdjieff's teachings. Ouspensky also left a school in England, which also continues teaching his version of the fourth way. And then there's Rodney Collins, is someone who was a student that started his own school, I think, in South America. And then there's J.G. Bennett, who also, I believe, started his own school. He was a student of Gurdjieff. I think he started it in England as well, or somewhere in Europe. So there are all these different branches. They all have kind of a slightly different flavor. And then there's different, like, online schools that you can Google and find. I personally wouldn't, you know, um, and this is just my own preference. I'm not a school type person. So even though Gurdjieff was very big about, yes, you should join a school, or you should have a teacher, you should have a mentor, he also talked about the fact that the sometimes the best type of spiritual student is someone what's that's called an obi vatel, I think, which is a Russian word for um, essentially someone who is just like a normie middle class person that just kind of does his work and doesn't need a teacher, doesn't need anything except to listen to life, and they can sometimes get by even without a spiritual system, just by being a good person. They can be just as advanced as any guru. But sometimes if they find a system that works and they teach themselves, they can do just as good as someone who needs a teacher. So it really just, I think, depends on your temperament and what if you have that kind of motivation and willpower to really drive you. Gurdjieff's opinion that some people needed to hand over their will to a teacher so that they could learn to develop their own will, and that was sometimes the only way to develop your will is to hand it over to someone else for a time. um, so that may be a need for someone in particular. My own personality, I needed my own will, I needed my own um, I needed to be my own teacher, and so I, kind of did everything myself, all the reading, all the work, all the things. I just kind of found what I needed when I needed it. But so I really think it just depends on the person whether or not they're more socially inclined and they need that kind of interaction and that accountability from a teacher. Sometimes that is useful. For my type of personality, that's just the opposite of what I needed. But I could see how someone could go either way. But I think the most important thing is just the tools are there, the knowledge is there. Most of it you can get for free. um, you know you can certainly find good teachers out there. But it just kind of depends on where you're at and what you're looking for.
Yeah, so what would you say the biggest misconception or misinformation people have about the fourth way? Like, if there was something you could correct or change people's perception of, what would that be?
um, I don't know. I think I don't see a ton of misconceptions out there. Mostly what I see is just ignorance of the fourth way, and I guess some people kind of will write it off, especially like people who are more on the Buddhist side that are just like, why are you analyzing everything so much? Just go meditate or whatever. But I think that this type of path is definitely an intellectual path, so it's not for everyone. It does require a degree of slyness. Gurdjieff called it the way of the sly man. It's in some cases it's almost like a cheat code or shortcut through the spiritual journey because you're just cutting out a lot of the BS. But it also requires a lot of outside of the box thinking in order to get there. So it's I feel like most of what I see from people who diss the system, they just really don't understand it, or it's just maybe not for them. But yeah, that I guess that would probably be my biggest thing.
So, if you were to give one piece of advice for anyone who's listening to this and wants to begin this path, what would you tell your beginner fourth way self? What would be the advice you would give?
um I guess my advice would be to not to not to get too lost in the weeds with all of the different philosophy, but really to focus on consistently practicing self-remembering as like kind of the key thing. Because I got lost in a lot of the philosophy and the systems, and it was all very interesting, don't get me wrong, but for a while I was kind of neglecting the actual practice of it, and it can be easy to do that. So you have to really balance the knowledge and the practice. And that's one thing that Gurdjieff said as well, is that kind of your level of advancement depends on your ability to balance out your knowledge with your being. And if you get past a certain point, if your knowledge gets too advanced for your being, or your being gets too advanced, then you're going to be out of whack in some capacity, and it'll backfire in the long run. So um, just kind of balancing out the knowledge with the practice, and just kind of being diligent about it, and not worrying if you don't understand everything at first. Pick up the things that you can understand and just keep moving, and you'll find something else that you'll understand, and then that will take you deeper into something else, and so on and so forth. So it's a lot of interconnectedness, and as you first start to read it, it may not make sense, but eventually one thing will kind of lead to another, and open up ideas, and that's I think the way that you have to approach this is not like an ideology, but as a systematic framework to kind of wrestle with ideas, and to experience them in practice, and that's why Gurdjieff said that you don't need faith for this particular practice, because you see the results in your own life, and you should be able to verify all of these techniques with your own experimentation. And so that's the goal of these ideas. It's not to believe them. It's not to um, not just to have a set of dead facts, but to um, have tools and ideas to wrestle with, and to bring into your everyday life, so that you can open up the vista behind the curtain of what is actually going on in the esoteric world. And really, I think it's the unification of understanding that the esoteric world and the everyday world, they're the same. Like, they're the exact same, once from a certain point of view. And so once you can understand kind of that balance, um, you're more in touch with reality, and therefore you have more agency over your life.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you? Where do you exist on the internet? Um, yeah,
Yeah, I'm on Twitter as the Fourth Way YT is my handle, and then same for YouTube as well.
perfect. Thank you so much for coming on. This has been your host, Georgina Rose, or Dot Darling. You can find me on every platform under the sun at the username Dot Darling. This podcast is supported through Patreon. So if you want more episodes of this show, please join the podcast Patreon. You get a pre show every single episode, which is a bonus little solo clip that I record before my guests show up. You also get an extra episode 8 times a year and early access to all of the shows. So check all that out. And I will see you all in the next one. Have an amazing day, night, afternoon, mid morning, mid evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are.